Winter, 1882. Somewhere between the edge of Utah Territory and the shadow of a forgotten ridge, a man named Jonah Rourke found something the earth was never meant to carry. A child, starving, barefoot, half buried in snow and ash. No name, no tracks, no voice left to cry for help, just bones, skin, and silence. But this wasn't just a tragedy, it was a message. The boy had been left behind, not by accident, but on purpose, a trap set by human predators. Jonah didn't know that yet. All he knew was that something inside him broke wide open when he lifted the child off the frozen ground. It wasn't pity. It was rage, not just at whoever abandoned the boy, but at the kind of world that allowed it. 4 days later, 3 women appeared at his doorstep, battered, silent, wrapped in torn deerskin and defiance. They weren't just survivors, they were escapees from a convoy of flesh traders headed south. And they had come back for the boy, and for a chance to stand still without being hunted. This wasn't a rescue story, it was a resistance. What followed wasn't family in the traditional sense. It was something forged from survival, from shared fury, and from a vow no one dared speak out loud. We will never be owned again. And in the middle of it all stood Jonah, a man who once lost everything, now forced to decide whether he would risk it all again. This time, not for memory but for justice. Jonah didn't find the boy by accident. That morning, the wind didn't just howl across the ridge, it screamed. It tore through his coat like claws and yanked the breath from his chest as he walked the crooked north fence. The kind of cold that slices a man open without leaving a mark. But it wasn't the weather that made him stop mid-step. It was the crows. 5 of them. Circling low and silent over a patch of ground near the fence post that always gave him trouble. He unlatched the gate with gloved fingers, boots crunching across the frost-hardened dirt. And then he saw it. A lump in the snow, unmoving. Bare skin peeking through ash and ice. At first, it looked like an old bundle of animal hide. But then he saw the fingers, tiny, blue-tinged, curled stiff like claws. And he knew. It was a child, a boy. Apache, maybe 6 years old. No shoes, no coat, no name, just bones and frozen breath. Jonah dropped to his knees, hands shaking, rage already rising like bile. Not sorrow, not fear, rage. This wasn't a child lost in the woods. This was abandonment, deliberate and staged. Jonah knew enough of war and wickedness to read the signs. The ash had been scattered to confuse scent. The body left in plain sight but without tracks leading away. Whoever had done this had wanted the boy to die here, alone, forgotten. And more importantly, they wanted him to be found. He peeled off his wool coat and wrapped it around the boy's brittle frame. The child didn't cry, didn't move, just blinked once, slowly, as if waking from death. Jonah hoisted him up, bones light as air, and turned back toward the mule. He didn't speak. He didn't curse. His anger had gone deeper than words. The ride back was silent, except for the sound of the child's faint breath against Jonah's collar. Inside the cabin, he stoked the fire until the stones glowed red. He laid the boy down by the stove, wrapped in furs and washed the dirt from his hands. The water turned black with soot and blood. He didn't ask questions, didn't need answers. The story was carved into the boy's bruises. Rope burns, fingernail marks, blunt trauma hidden under thin buckskin. Jonah had seen women dragged through slave trains in New Mexico, had watched U.S. cavalrymen sell Apache girls in the backs of saloons for whiskey. This boy had come from that same darkness, and whoever had left him here hadn't just underestimated Jonah, they'd miscalculated what kind of man he'd become. He was no longer a soldier, no longer a husband, but he was still a man. And some things, some acts, deserved war. Jonah placed a knife under the pillow beside the boy and sat in the chair across from him, rifle across his knees, eyes never leaving the door. He didn't know who would come next, but they would. And when they did, they wouldn't find an empty cabin. They'd find him. Waiting. It wasn't footsteps that warned Jonah. It was the mule. Just before dawn, the old beast snorted sharp and backed away from the northern gate, ears pinned, legs stiff. Jonah stepped outside with his rifle, the cold slapping his skin like a warning bell. The sky was still dark, a soft iron blue bleeding into pale gray. And there, at the edge of the rise, stood three figures, still as stones, braids swaying in the wind. Women. He didn't speak. Neither did they. Jonah recognized danger, but this wasn't it. No weapons drawn, no threats made. Just silence. Thick, cold, intentional. These weren't strangers. These were ghosts walking the land they were never meant to leave. He took a step forward, rifle lowered but not away. The woman in front, tall, heavy at the hips, strong in the shoulders, watched him without blinking. Her dress was torn, stitched crudely across the ribs with rawhide. A crude blade hung at her side, wrapped in linen. Her hands were cracked and red. Her voice, when it finally came, was low and even. "You have our son." It wasn't a question. Jonah's gut twisted. The boy inside had spoken no words, but this was the answer. He nodded slowly. "He's alive. Sleeping." The woman didn't move. The two behind her remained still. One older, cloaked in deer hide, face bruised and burned in places. The other barely more than a girl, no more than 17, clutching a bone-handled knife to her chest like it was her last name. Jonah's instinct said to be cautious, but another part, deeper, older, told him the truth. These weren't women who wandered into danger. These were women who survived it and carried it with them in silence. He stepped back, opened the door. "Come in." They didn't hesitate. Inside, the fire still glowed. The boy stirred beneath layers of fur. The woman, Ilani, he would soon learn, crossed the floor in 3 strides and dropped to her knees. Her hands didn't shake, she didn't cry. She only held him, pressing her forehead to his, whispering something in a language Jonah had only ever heard spoken in screams during raids. The boy's eyes opened, and for the first time he reached for someone. The other two stayed by the door, watching, not afraid, just alert. Like women who'd been hunted too long to ever let go of the chase behind them. Jonah poured water, set it on the table, then pulled down what little food he had left. Dried beans, a cut of salt pork, hard bread. He didn't speak. Neither did they. But when Ilani finally took the bread and tore it cleanly, giving the first piece to the boy, the air shifted. It was something close to peace, but not quite. After a long silence, she looked up. "Why did you help him?" Jonah rubbed his jaw, the scar on his cheek pulsing under his palm. "Because someone should have." Ilani studied him. "That's not the kind of reason men usually give." He met her gaze, steel to steel. "I'm not the kind of man they usually are." She didn't argue. That night, they didn't ask to stay. He didn't offer. They simply made space where there was none. The older woman, Taya, laid her battered body beside the fire, curling her thin frame into the shadows. The youngest, Kaya, sat upright by the window, the knife still clutched, her eyes never closing. Jonah didn't sleep. He sat in his chair, rifle across his lap, the boys' quiet breathing behind him, and 3 survivors within arm's reach. His cabin, once silent by choice, was now full of people who had nothing, and yet somehow carried more weight than any man he'd ever known. As the fire cracked low and snow began to fall again, he understood the unspoken. They hadn't just come for the child. They had come because there was no world left behind them. And if what he suspected was true, that slavers had left that boy out there as bait, then hell wasn't done coming. But neither was Jonah. Jonah didn't ask questions the next morning. He just watched. The women moved like smoke through the cabin, soft, steady, never still. Kaya hadn't released the knife all night. Now she sat by the window sharpening its edge with a whetstone taken from Jonah's tool chest without asking. Taya boiled roots she'd found in the thawing earth behind the barn. And Ilani? She hadn't let go of the boy once. Not even when she stirred the fire. One hand always on his chest, like a shield no longer made of metal, but of skin and breath and blood. Jonah drank his coffee black. His eyes stayed on the frost gathering at the corners of the window, but his mind was back in the dirt, at that fence post. The way the body had been positioned, the lack of tracks. The scent of kerosene faint on the boy's hair. That hadn't been a mistake. That had been a message. And now that he had opened his door, he was part of it. That afternoon, as the wind dropped and snow melted into patches, Jonah headed to the barn to check the traps he'd set along the tree line. Ailani followed without speaking, the boy asleep inside. She wore his coat again, not out of warmth, but of warning. They didn't speak until they reached the corral. She leaned against the fence, arms crossed. Her face was weathered but held together by will, not softness. Her dress still hung in shreds at the hem, her braid bound tight like rope. Jonah checked the snare. Empty. He turned to her. "You're not hiding," he said flatly. "No," she answered. "Not anymore." He waited. She didn't owe him anything, but she gave it anyway. "They used to wait for night," she said. "Wait for the men to be out hunting or drinking. Then they'd take the women, one by one, quiet, quick, leave a mark, leave a message." Her eyes didn't waver. But this time, they came at sunrise, on horseback, with dogs. They didn't take women. They took all of us, bound us, branded us, called us product, moved us like cattle. Jonah's jaw clenched. Ailani's voice hardened. Taya was sold twice before she escaped. Kaya fought one of them off. She cut his throat and ran barefoot through 2 miles of thistle and mud. I was supposed to be next. They made us dig a pit for the ones who couldn't walk anymore. She paused. I buried my sister in that pit. The wind shifted. Jonah didn't move. Not yet. "And the boy?" he asked. "They took him from me," she said. "Put him in a separate cart. Said children get a higher price if they're not spoiled by grief. So we broke the locks. Set a fire. Took what we could carry. Ran into the dark like rats." Her hands trembled once, then stilled. "I found him near the river 2 days later. Too weak to follow. Too small to remember where we told him to hide. We didn't have time to carry him. We thought—" Her voice faltered. "We thought we'd lost him." Jonah stared at the ground. "You didn't." Ailani turned to him, her gaze sharp as the blade Kaya still held inside. "You don't know what's following us." "No," Jonah replied, lifting his eyes. "But I know what I'll do if it gets here." That night, he fortified the windows, nailed boards across the ones facing north, moved the stove to the center wall to create less light from outside, set tripwire lines from the barn to the back fence. If anyone came, they wouldn't catch him sleeping. But something changed in him too. Not just in his hands, in his presence. He didn't just sharpen his rifle. He began to teach Kaya how to hold one. He didn't just watch Ailani tend the boy. He asked her to teach him the boy's name in her tongue, Toma. He didn't just let Taya hum old war songs into the fire. He listened. And when Kaya crept out to relieve herself near the tree line and returned with panic tightening her breath, Jonah didn't ask what she'd seen. He just reached for the rifle. 3 riders, she said, far off, but they weren't hunting deer. Jonah stepped outside, the snow crunching underfoot. He scanned the ridge and said nothing. Because he knew now, this wasn't his past coming back, it was their war spilling forward. And he had opened his door. Now he would not close it again. Jonah didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window with the fire dying low, his rifle across his lap, and the storm pressing like breath against the glass. But the cold didn't bother him. Not anymore. Not when he knew eyes were watching from the tree line. By morning the wind had dropped, but the danger hadn't. Ailani stepped outside first. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for an escort. She wrapped herself in Jonah's coat again, this time tighter, like armor, not comfort, and walked to the creek to fetch water. Jonah watched her from the doorway, steam rising off the boiling pot behind him. She moved like someone who knew her life could end before sundown, and had made peace with that. Inside, Kaya was teaching Toma how to tie knots with scrap twine from Jonah's saddlebag. Taya silently scrubbed the wooden floorboards near the hearth with an old shirt dipped in vinegar water. Her knees shook from effort, but she kept moving. Not to clean, but to claim. To erase the last hands that had ever dragged her, sold her, shackled her. This wasn't healing. This was wartime nesting. Jonah stepped back into the cabin and closed the door with slow, deliberate force. The boy looked up. Kaya nodded toward the rifle. Did they move? He didn't answer. But the answer was yes. He'd seen the new hoofprints in the snow. Close enough to see his smoke. They were being surrounded, slowly, methodically, like prey. He poured a mug of coffee and sat at the table. We have 2 days, maybe 3, he said. Ailani returned with the bucket. Her boots were soaked through. She placed the metal down near the fire and looked him in the eye. Then we used them. They didn't plan with maps. They planned with instinct. Jonah taught Kaya how to reload and fire under pressure. Taya began sharpening sticks into ground spikes and buried them at the property's edge. Ailani reinforced the inside of the cabin using furniture, sacks of grain, and an overturned trough for shielding. Jonah redug the root cellar hatch and packed it with food, blankets, and 2 loaded pistols, if it came to escape. But what changed most wasn't their readiness. It was their rhythm. Jonah noticed it in the way Kaya stopped flinching when he passed behind her. In the way Taya started humming old tribal songs while working, low and hollow, like the belly of a drum. In the way Ailani no longer turned her back to the door when she sat down to eat. These were not the habits of hunted women. These were the instincts of wolves reclaiming their den. That night, Ailani knelt beside Toma's bed, brushing his hair from his forehead with slow, steady fingers. Jonah stood in the doorway, arms crossed, jaw tight. He watched as the boy leaned into her, touch without fear for the first time. You said he was bait, Ailani whispered. Jonah nodded. Still believe that? Then they'll come for him again. Or for all of you. She looked up. And you? I've killed men for less than what was done to him. Her expression didn't soften. It hardened. Good. A wind kicked up outside, rattling the shutters. Kaya's hand went to the hilt of her knife automatically. Taya stopped humming. Jonah didn't move. This house isn't just a place anymore, Ailani said. It's a line. He looked at her. And every man who crosses it needs to learn what it means to stand on the wrong side. She stood then, shoulders squared, spine straight, and walked toward him. Not as someone asking for safety, but as someone offering alliance. Her hand rested on his shoulder for a moment. Brief, grounding. Whatever comes through those trees, she said, they're not going to find the same women they left in chains. Jonah didn't answer. He just nodded once, slow and grave. That night, as the cabin held its breath against the wind, 5 people sat in the firelight, not as guests or hosts, not as strangers, but as something closer to a unit. Not a family yet, but something earned, something chosen. Outside, the snow whispered. Inside, no one slept. They didn't need to. Because now, they weren't just waiting. They were ready. They came before sunrise. Not with noise, but with calculation. 3 riders at first, then 5 more, crawling down the ridge like shadows that knew the land. They wore gray coats, unmarked. Civilian enough to pass through towns, military enough to kill without pause. Jonah had been waiting. He'd slept beside the front door with his boots on and his rifle loaded. When Kaya shook him, her voice was a whisper. They're here. He was already standing. Inside, the cabin moved without panic. It moved like a machine built in pain. Taya pulled Toma down into the cellar with food and a quilt. Kaya took her post near the window Jonah had cut a sniper hole into. Ailani stood by the hearth, blade in hand, eyes locked on the door. Jonah opened the top half of the barn gate and waited. The first man rode up with a white cloth tied to his saddle horn. He smiled too wide, too fast. We're just looking for property, friend, he called. Lost a few girls and a little redskin boy. Jonah didn't answer. The man leaned forward. Don't want no trouble. Boss just wants what he paid for. That's when Jonah raised the shotgun. Just slightly. Not yet a threat. Just enough to be seen. The man's smile tightened. You don't want to die over 3 whores and a half-blood runt. Jonah pulled the trigger. The man flew off the horse like meat tossed from a cart. Silence. Then the hill exploded with movement. Men charging, rifles drawn, fury awakened. But Jonah was already running. He ducked into the trench Kaya, and he had dug 2 nights before, rolled behind the split log barricade and began firing. One rider fell, screaming. Another staggered back with his arm dangling loose. From inside, Kaya opened fire with Jonah's old long rifle. 2 more went down. The others hesitated. Jonah reloaded fast. His fingers didn't tremble. This wasn't a defense. This was a statement. We are not prey. The battle didn't last long. 15 minutes of dirt, blood, gunpowder, and grit. Jonah took a hit to the shoulder. Kaya's cheek was grazed. Taya never left the cellar. But when it was over, 4 men lay dead. 2 wounded had crawled back up the ridge. 1 horse bled out by the barn. Ailani stood over the final man. He was gasping, gut-shot, a red bloom growing in his stomach. She held her knife, not like a weapon, but like an answer. You branded us like cattle, she said. Sold our voices. Thought you owned our silence. He coughed, tried to speak. She drove the blade in slow. You don't get to speak anymore. When it was done, she didn't shake. She just turned to Jonah. It's over, she said. He nodded, then looked past her to the boy peeking out from the cellar door. Toma didn't cry. He just watched, saw everything. Jonah walked over, crouched, and pulled the boy into his arms. You're safe, he said. But the boy didn't answer. He placed a small palm over Jonah's wounded shoulder, and for the first time Jonah felt seen. Not as a savior, but as someone chosen. They buried the bodies behind the barn. No words, just stone markers, no names. That night, the cabin didn't feel like a shelter. It felt like sovereignty. Taya sat near the fire, her hair down, humming not to hide the silence, but to fill it. Kaya cleaned every rifle piece with precision. Jonah stitched his shoulder shut with whiskey and gritted teeth. And Ailani? She leaned against the wall, eyes closed, breathing slow. You don't owe us anything, she said. Jonah didn't look at her. That's not how this works. She opened her eyes. What is this then? He paused. It's not charity. It's not pity. It's a home. If you want it. She walked over, stood in front of him. You're not saving us, she said. I know, he replied. You're saving me too. She took his hand, not to ask, not to promise, but to choose. Outside, the snow fell again. Inside, a fire burned, not just from wood and spark, but from will. What began as survival was now something stronger, a vow that could not be bought, could not be sold, and would never again be silenced. And if the world came knocking again, they'd answer it together. This wasn't just a story of survival, it was a lesson in defiance. In a world where human lives were priced and traded like cattle, dignity had to be reclaimed through action, not permission. The women who escaped didn't ask to be saved. They demanded the right to stand on their own feet. And Jonah Rourke, once a man broken by loss, didn't become a hero by speaking grand words. He became one by choosing to stay, to protect, and to rebuild alongside them. The greatest lesson here is that healing isn't passive. It's earned, through risk, through pain, and through the daily act of refusing to be reduced to what the world expects of you. Sometimes, justice doesn't wear a badge or carry a gavel. Sometimes it's a woman with a blade, a child who refuses to flinch, or a man who nails a broken door shut so no more evil can enter. Trust, like freedom, is never given freely. It's chosen again and again, not in safety, but in the midst of danger. And love? Love isn't soft in this world. It's forged in fire, in loyalty, in shared silence. In the end, they didn't just survive the men who hunted them. They buried the very idea that anyone had the right to own them. And that is the true definition of liberation.